that you do here in your community. I just want to start by going back a little bit. In 1995, I had the good fortune of joining the national office of what was then Big Brothers of Canada. Actually, Gail was one of my references for the job. That shows you how long ago we were just sitting there like, that's a while we've known each other.
We've known each other before that.
Yeah, exactly. And it was interesting to go into an organization that had this incredible brand reputation and was doing this amazing work across the country, but to discover actually that the national organization was really struggling. It lost money 7 out of 8 years in a row. It was embroiled in a lawsuit with Big Sisters at the time over the use of the brand. There were 3 layers of governance that were not functioning all that well. And I think most importantly, the number of kids that the organization had been serving had sort of stagnated for about 5 or 6 years at about 9,500 kids being served in mentoring relationships across the country. And I remember going into the job, and my wife and I had a young child at that point, and twins on the way coming up. And it was interesting because basically I got pulled into a meeting in that time from when I left my other job and was starting and was told, drop everything on your job description, and I was hired as the director of marketing, and go find money because we're out of cash in 10 months. And I remember going home, what the heck have I done here? Gone to a kind of an unstable organization. And it was interesting. So we got in and we started to dig into the work, and we had a new national executive director was called at the time. And that person, together with our incoming board chair and a seasoned board director, went to a conference about 6 months later. And they came back from the conference and they said, we're convinced that there's only one thing that we need to do to start reinventing this organization. And that is to create a culture of adaptation, innovation, and change. So it wasn't about raising more money. It wasn't talking about administrative bureaucracy. It wasn't even talking about programs. It was actually talking about how we could set ourselves up to be open to the idea of change. And so really, that's what I'm here to do tonight, is to invite you to think about that. So imagine Canada, which is an organization which works on behalf of Canada's 86,000 registered charities, some of the 90,000 nonprofits. We specialize in the public benefit, not the private benefit ones like condo boards and golf course boards and things like that. And the 7,000 social enterprises in Canada to try and create a climate in which organizations that you represent, work for, and volunteer for can thrive. And so one of the things I've learned in working for national organizations most of my career is that there is not a solution in Canada. There is a multitude of solutions. You know your communities best. You know your organizations best. And what we do at Imagine Canada is we invite people into conversations, either with data or questions or just thoughts. And the invitation is to take those back to your organizations and think about it and talk about it. Because you'll invent your own solutions, because there's not just one solution in this country. So to do that, I want to start off with something that we at Imagine Canada call the social deficit. So I'm very privileged to work for an organization that had the foresight to hire a chief economist for Canada's nonprofit and charitable sector. To the best of our knowledge, it's the only position of its kind in the world. We have a classically trained economist, a lifelong federal civil servant, who now spends all of his time thinking about this sector and what it means to our nation. Because most people in Canada don't realize that the charitable and nonprofit sector employs 2.4 million Canadians, is 8.5% of gross domestic product, and has about 13 million volunteers every year contributing their time. We employ more people than fisheries, mining, agriculture, public utilities, and public administration. But most people don't think of us that way because we rarely get together and present ourselves as a sector. Yet I would argue that this sector is part of the very fabric of society, and it's part of what makes us Canadian. It is part of us helping each other as neighbors, as citizens, as community members. And we have to nurture that and make sure that in these changing times that this sector is around and able to provide services well into the future. So in 2016, Brian Emmett, who's our chief economist, actually wrote a paper called The Social Deficit. And basically what that is, it's the gap between rising demand for services and the ability of society to pay for it. And so what we see in an era of rising income inequality is the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And so what happens when the rich get richer? Well, you know what? Can a shrinking middle class make up from a philanthropic way? Because, rich people give. But can they make up for that gap? Probably not. The data's telling us probably not. At the same time, what happens when the poor get poorer? No. They come to you. Demand goes up. So supply goes down, demand goes up. It's actually a terrible math equation for us. And so what's driving this? Well, there's a number of things. I mean, most economists, if you look at the Parliamentary Budget Office, if you look at Don Drummond, the former chief economist for TD Bank, are all projecting that economic growth in the coming 20 years will be a lot slower than it was for the last 20 years. Last 20 years, GDP growth was about 3%. They're actually estimating 1.6 to 1.8%. As a sector that is aligned to the health of the economy through grants, contributions, donations, etc., sponsorships, when the economy does well, that's good news for the sector. It's a more challenging time when the economy's not doing well. Rising income inequality, a rapidly aging population that is in part also driving demand. As the sandwich generation's now not just looks after its kids, it's also looking after its aging parents, and other things. We estimate that by 2026, the social deficit will be $25 billion. So we'll put it in context in a couple of ways. So first of all, this is a deficit that won't appear on balance sheets. This will appear when someone calls for mental health services for their adolescent son or daughter, and the response on the other end of the phone is, I'm sorry, intake is closed for the next 6 months. We're not seeing any new people. Or in smaller rural communities where organizations have been around for a long time, simply close the doors and move and try and figure out different ways of delivering services. Also, right now, Canadians as individuals give about $14.3 billion to primarily registered charities in this country. So the deficit in a decade, less than a decade, is going to be double what we as citizens give now. So it's time to wrap our heads around what this means. So just to let you know, this is the motivational pick-me-up part of the presentation. But it's interesting. What it means for our sector, no matter how you slice and dice the numbers, is that there's changes that are required in the way we who lead organizations think. There's, the math just doesn't work for us. So the only way these services are going to be enhanced and preserved is for us to adopt a different mindset. And so as we think about this VUCA term, we're living it right now. Organizations in Ontario and Manitoba and Alberta that have been reliant on provincial dollars are feeling a significant disruption right now. As we look at the trends in giving, while raw dollar numbers are going up, one of the things that we're witnessing is the number of donors is going down. It's interesting. I use a lot of sports analogies. We're losing our farm team. What I mean by that is when we interview philanthropists and ask them how they learn to give, many of them cite places of worship. In 1965, 50% of Canadians self-identified that they went to a church, temple, synagogue, etc., at least once a week. That's now less than 10%. And when you think about it, those philanthropists said they watched their parents put an envelope or a $10 bill into the collection plate, or they themselves were given $1 to participate. We live in an era of invisible philanthropy. If you live in a traditional family, mom or dad at 11 o'clock at night are busy, they pull out their credit card, they go online, they make a contribution. We've actually done some studying and realized that kids don't even know that they live in incredibly generous households because they don't witness the act of giving anymore. So how are we seeding generations of future philanthropists? So these are the kinds of changes that are taking place in our society that we need to be mindful of. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share some insights that's based on absolutely no empirical data. Okay, I have this privilege of working for an organization where I get to go across the country all the time and talk to organizations and have conversations about the challenges and see the ones who are adapting and changing. And I'm going to share what I've observed to be some patterns that maybe are things that you think about in your own organizations. The first one is how organizations and leaders see possibilities. And to start off with, I'm talking about an organization called Art House. This is a very small organization. It's based in the Halton region. They serve schools in the Burlington, Oakville, Milton, Orangeville kind of region. And it was created by a gentleman who said, you know what, I'm really worried that arts programs, music, painting, sculpture, are being stripped out of the school curriculum. And that there are citizens or kids in our communities whose families simply can't afford to compensate through private courses or private education. So this group formed primarily as volunteers. They now have 2 staff, that's it. And they run arts programs in schools in partnership with classrooms and the school boards. And I had a chance to go to their annual meeting and speak at it. And it was just amazing. I gotta tell you, it was brutal in one way, because I had to speak right after like 6-year-olds got up and did a song and dance number. They might as well have had a basket of puppies and then put me up to talk about the Income Tax Act. It was brutal. But it's just this amazing organization that is finding ways to make art relevant to a group of kids whose families simply can't afford to engage them in this program because they don't have the financial means to do so. But I was really intrigued by some new things that they're doing. They're seeing ways to bring art to the community in different ways. And one of them is so this is kind of their sort of mantra as they're going forward. They're looking at how to unleash creativity, how to educate kids, and how to really involve this as calls to action. And they're doing this both in conversations around environmental responsibility and Indigenous work. And I'm just going to cite sort of 2 programs that they're doing. One is called this Canoe Garden Project. And it's a really interesting partnership. They've gone out and gotten 4 old wooden canoes. And the kids have stripped them all down, so they're just bare now. And the kids are going to design artwork that will go on the outside of these canoes. They've now partnered with a social enterprise on the Six Nations Reserve in Brantford. And Indigenous peoples will be filling it with soil and plants that are native to the area. The kids then are going to be working with decorating all of these canoes, and the 4 city halls and town halls of the communities in which they serve have agreed to put these on display all summer with signage that talks about the Art House and the work that they're doing. So right off the bat, kids are finding ways to get involved. It's about art, it's about the land, it's about our Indigenous contribution, and it's about gardening and plants. It's not a traditional view of art programs. Getting kids outside, getting dirty, and doing some of these things. And the other one that's kind of neat is the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup. And what they're doing is for older young people, or adolescents in their programs, what they're doing is they're going and taking them onto shoreline cleanups in the rivers in the region in which they serve. They're taking all the garbage, they're stripping out all the plastic, having it all sterilized, and then the young people are designing art installations with the garbage that is found in the rivers. And they're also doing education with the whole environmental network around environmental responsibility, what it means to leave our planet in a better place. But then these installations, again, are going to be going on display. And so in this idea of seeing possibilities, it wasn't necessarily just about traditional provision of art programs. Let's go sit in a room somewhere, let's paint. No, it's getting kids outside, involved, finding new partnerships, and creating a new way of presenting this organization. The neat part is they're also attracting sponsors and funding as part of it. So I think RBC is one of their initial funders. It's brand new, it's just getting ready to launch, but they're actually attracting new forms of support that have never supported Art House before in order to do this. Relevancy, new possibilities. The next one is this idea of sort of insane courage. You know, it's funny, I hear all too often barriers and blockages, particularly, and I don't mean this in any disrespect, at board tables. Because let's face it, in our industry, the boards of directors are the owners of the organizations, they're the shareholders, they're ultimately responsible for what happens with the organization. The flip side to that is in a chronically under-resourced industry, our appetite for risk is a lot lower. We don't have R&D budgets like the corporate community where they will go and experiment and play and try. One of the challenges is that if we try and be innovative, it usually comes out of the main operating budget, which means it can't fail. It has to be successful because if it fails, it costs the organization money. Well, that's actually counterintuitive to the concepts of true innovation, where you try, fail, learn, adapt, try, fail, learn, adapt, so you keep getting till you get it right. And so there's kind of structural design flaw in there. So the idea of how do we start to build courage for organizations into the way we think. And I'm not talking about totally unrealistic courage, but courage that stretches us in a way that we might try something that we've never tried before. And I don't know how many of you, have anybody ever heard of this organization in Toronto called Goodfoot Delivery? Yeah. So it's kind of neat. It's been around for almost 10 years. And what it is it's a courier service. It's a courier service, personalized point-to-point delivery on foot and public transit, creating employment opportunities for people with developmental disabilities. They're a social enterprise and a registered charity. And by supporting Goodfoot, I've just taken this right off their website. They support environmentally friendly delivery service and helping members of the community get a foothold on independence. So every one of their couriers has developmental disability. Most of them are on the autism spectrum, many with Asperger's. And this organization now has gainfully employing 40 couriers. They have over 700 clients. They are competing against FedEx, Purolator, and all the rest. The couriers use public transit or bike, and they go around and deliver all over in the city of Toronto. They actually had started to expand, and they've pulled it back in because the transportation system is critical to the success of this. But think about the conversation at the board table when this thing was being invented. We're going to take people who are having trouble being self-sufficient, we're going to employ them, we're going to get paid to do it. This isn't free. We get paid to do this. We're competing against the behemoths in the industry, and then we're just going to send them off across the city. And away they go. So from an insurance perspective, from a liability perspective, from all kinds of perspectives, the vision to push past the initial apprehension and create a business model that can work, to me, is absolutely stellar. And they're continuing to grow this organization. As a matter of fact, the founder, one of the reasons that she started this, her brother is affected with a developmental disability. He's now left the company to start his own business. And they're finding more and more of these stories of people who, once empowered on how to do this, are now moving into other areas of work. Insane courage. The next concept is sort of this idea of new fashioned allies. It's funny, when I was with Big Brothers Big Sisters, we would often go to these national meetings and sit down, and there'd be Boys and Girls Clubs and Scouts and Guides and the 2Ys and 4-H and all the rest of us. It was always in the youth serving space though. And what I'm becoming more and more convinced is that great collaborations have less to do with the mission or cause and more to do with the mindset of leaders getting together and finding ways to work together. And so I'm going to take it on kind of an international one here. And this is right off an organization's website. Why did we decide to create these unlikely alliances? In order to move from a tiny voluntary-run campaign to getting something big happening on the ground, we needed serious support from big organizations. To foment real change and avoid business as usual, we wanted to put together some unlikely partners. We felt the friction and the exchange of ideas and expertise that happens at the edge can help create this change for good. And this is an organization out of the UK. It's called Cola Life. And the Unlikely Alliances is actually right in their brand positioning line. And again, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this organization, but it was built on 3 observations. One is that in developing nations, particularly in Africa, 1 in 8 children die before the age of 5 from preventable diseases. And the number 2 preventable disease is dehydration caused by diarrhea. Something we in Canada wouldn't even shake our heads at. We just go down to the pharmacy. Number 2, medical science had created very inexpensive treatments for this. The problem was getting it there. And the 3rd observation is, we can't get medicine there, but why is it in every village in Africa you can buy a bottle of Coca-Cola? So what they did was they went online and they started Facebooking Coke. And they asked them to respond. And so we want to have a conversation about, how are you doing this? How do you get Coke bottles to these remote African villages, and yet the governments and we, the doctors, can't get medicine there? Facebook responded. Coca-Cola responded on Facebook. And they started to have a conversation. And what they realized was that Coke's brilliance was, not just the product, but they had created an amazing distribution system where Coke trucks would drive into a local village, and entrepreneurs hired by Coke, self-employed people, would take their bicycles from remote areas, cycle into the bigger village, and then they would cycle back with a crate of Coca-Cola bottles on the back of their bicycle. They would then sell it, and they would keep their share of the profits. They were actually business people and entrepreneurs. And that's how they had solved the delivery system. So then they said, well, this is great, but we can't set up a Coca-Cola system. So what they did was they invented, with Coke's help, and then now they went broader, and they went to Johnson & Johnson and other pharmaceutical companies, this device which actually fits in between the bottles of Coca-Cola. And they partnered with Coke to create and build on top of their distribution system. So now not only are the people on the bicycles entrepreneurs selling Coke, they are now selling for less than $1 incredibly inexpensive medicine that will be life-changing in their communities. And so this has grown. This organization is almost all volunteer-based. But it was interesting because they had some real pushback when they started to go to these unlikely partners. You're selling your soul if you go and talk to Coca-Cola because their product is not healthy. You're doctors. How can you be partnering with Coca-Cola? So what they did was they said, what we'll do is we'll talk to them for business knowledge and expertise, but we will not receive any sponsorship dollars from them. We want to make sure that it's clear that we're in the health business and not the health detriment business. And they had the same kind of pushback when they started to deal with other, groups in the pharmaceutical, big pharma, other sort of companies that were part of this process. And they said, look, our mission is to help these people. We'll find ethical, appropriate ways to have these conversations. And this is now an award-winning program globally that is saving thousands and thousands of lives again. But it was this idea of sort of new fashion allies, not the same old groups that we talk to all the time, but saying, we have a need, somebody else has an expertise. How do we find a way to tap into that expertise? And in this case, not even in the same sector, it was private sector. And this other idea that old can be new again, and I've been around the sector long enough to know that at staff tables and at board tables, an idea will come up, well, we tried that. We tried that before and it didn't work. And sometimes we tried it before and it did work, but we don't have the funding to do it again. I worry that there's great lessons in our past that we have to reflect on and then think about how to contextualize for modern times. But that the essence of what we do can still be incredibly powerful. And this is off a new initiative that just launched about 3 months ago, but it's based on a very old initiative. And our orange and black buttons draw on the refugee flag and symbolize the life vests of so many who had to wear it while looking for safety. And this button is featured on the left cuff of all of our shirts. And this is something that just launched out of Toronto called the Taylor Project. And it's kind of an interesting story. At the end of the Second World War,
the Canadian garment industry, like many industries, was facing a labor market shortage. They didn't have enough skilled tailors to man the sewing machines and create clothes. And so a group that was primarily funded by the Canadian Jewish Congress went, you know what? There are lots of qualified people in war-ravaged Europe. So they sent 5 Canadians overseas, and they started traveling to displacement camps in Austria and Germany, looking for skilled tailors. And it was called the Garment Workers Scheme, or Garment Workers Program, launched in 1947 and 1948, where the Canadian government, in partnership with the Canadian Jewish Congress, brought 2,500 skilled tailors and their families to this country. And what they did was they provided them with the guarantee of a job of equal pay of the other people in the factory for a minimum of 1 year. They also provided loans for living expenses and affordable accommodation. And in 2017, the son of one of the tailors said, we need to understand what happened with this program. And the Taylor Project was born. And effectively what it was is it's a narrative, it's a story about what the impact of these families, these immigrant families who came to Canada and became incredibly successful, incredible citizens of a new nation. And it's interesting, as we think about the impacts of immigration, the latest data tells us that immigrants are actually giving more on average per year than native-born Canadians. And so as we think about the contribution of Canadians, it's important. And so this is some of the photos from the earliest days. They're actually creating a video and a book to talk about the stories. But what's old is new again. What I think is really cool about this is that this organization, the Taylor Project, has now created a social enterprise. And they've now brought 100 Syrian refugee tailors over from wherever they found them, displaced in other parts of the world. And they've wrapped the same services around. And so hopefully in another 30 or 40 years, we'll be able to tell the story of another generation of people who came to our shores because of the foresightedness and the generosity of Canadian citizens and became productive, vibrant members of our community. I also think the other part that's so cool about this is this has been primarily driven by a Jewish organization that's now supporting a Syrian group. And I think that's part of what makes us special as Canadians. And so this is just getting started in terms of, and so the shirts that you saw with the orange button are actually custom-made shirts by Syrian tailors who are now living in Canada. They'll be going on sale shortly. If you look online, they're a little expensive, I gotta tell you, right now, but it's more of a fundraising thing. So whether it's new fashion allies, old can be new, insane courage, or seeing possibilities, I think these are concepts to go back to organizations and say, do we always talk to the same people? Have we done anything that has any risk? Are there opportunities sitting in front of us that we just haven't thought of before? And the final thought I'm going to leave you with is something I call adaptive DNA. So, I really believe that this sector must adapt and change constantly, and we have. You look at the power of this sector has been around for over 100 years. Over 150 years, depending on the organizations that you look at. So we have this ability, but I do think we struggle with it. So when I talk about adaptive DNA, it's how do we build a new core competency for change into our organizations? And it's one thing I don't think we as leaders talk about intentionally very much. So just think about the last time you went to recruit a board director. So we always look, well, it's good to have a lawyer on the board, an accountant, someone's got to look after the money. People with money, because they might donate. People from the cause, that's always good to have. And then other areas of expertise that we might invite to sit on our boards. When was the last time we asked someone when we were inviting them onto a board, have you ever led a major change initiative in your volunteer world or in your work life? Because again, go back to those conversations at the board and staff table. If it's a bit scary, generally it is easier to say no and do the same thing that we've always done. But wouldn't it be great if in the middle of that conversation, a voice was heard that said, you know what? We just did this at work 6 months ago. And yeah, we kind of stepped off a bit of a cliff, and we all held hands, and we hoped that it worked. But this isn't a stupid gamble. This isn't a stupid risk. We've done our homework. We've got our business plans. But if we see a different future for our organization, we might need to do something different. How do we seed the ability, the core competency to adapt and change in our organization? We gotta go look for people who aren't afraid of change. And not wild, chaotic, change that makes absolutely no sense, but enough capacity to try different things, to move agendas forward, to find new partners, and to go forward. So these are the ones that you want to find to sit at your board tables. When you're looking for staff, see where that appetite are. Are they enablers or are they resistors? And so just to come back, to circle back to where I started, which was the Big Brothers story. So I had the good fortune of working there for 19 years, both as the Director of Marketing and then the National CEO. And I look at the result of that reflection that our Executive Director and our incoming Board Chair and our established Board member had. And we went from an organization that was in, I think, fairly crummy shape, at least at the national level, to one that got rid of a level of governance, said let's get this simple, found new sponsors, watched as local organizations invented new mentoring programs, new ways to put kids together with quality, safe mentors. Not only resolved the lawsuit, the two organizations merged to create a stronger organization and a unified brand. When I started, there was 42 different logos, because I counted them up. 42 different logos in the Big Brothers Big Sisters world. But to me, the real measure of success, the organization's ability to adapt and change, was we went from serving 9,500 kids a year to over 42,000. It was exponential growth, powered by local communities who knew that it was okay to go find ways to invent and change, and that would be supported and that would be celebrated. So my invitation to you is, in VUCA times, think about ways to power your organizations forward by maybe doing something different and finding different partners, putting people on your boards and your staff. Because if you do, I think you'll find that the rewards will be huge. Thanks so much for your time tonight.